I am a man.
Picture this. You're sitting somewhere, maybe a library or something. Suddenly you notice someone running. But not just running, sprinting, frantically. But the look on their face is of pure terror and horror. Without asking any extra questions, you find yourself jolting up, running in the same direction as the person who just zipped right by you. It's only a few steps into this sudden marathon that you're on that you realize you don't know what you're running from, or why you're running for that matter. This reaction is of course an example of the physiological phenomenon known as fight or flight.
Excuse me, fight or flight, come through.
The difference between square up and run first, ask questions later has definitely saved one of y'all's lives before. I know it saved mine. Particularly for the black experience, constantly being on your toes and ready for whatever action comes your way is nearly a genetic remnant of generations of oppression. Black boys often get instilled with ideas of toughness so that they can become rigid, nonchalant, and hopefully immune to external and internal traumas that they may face as they get older. Obviously, we all know this leads to more harm down the road, leading many of them to develop unhealthy relationships in response to stressful events in their manhood. Enter Megalobox. We're set in a cyberpunk-light version of present-day Japan, where the world of boxing in particular has been enhanced literally by exoskeleton attachments people put on their bodies and go into the ring with. So, ignoring all the realities of how terrible this would probably be, on top of just the real danger faced with getting your face punched in a couple times, Junk Dog and his coach Nabu participate in fixed fights within the restricted area slums. Besides the realities of poverty, what keeps Junk Dog coming back to do these fights is the fact that he actually really loves to box. So much so that if he actually gave his all, he would wash most of the competition that comes in front of him. It's not until he meets a professional boxer named Yuri to where he decides to take boxing more seriously. He joins the new boxing circuit, Megalo, fakes his citizenship, changes his name to Joe, and fights his way through setbacks towards the top. It's a pretty by the numbers show in regard to sports underdog stories. Where it stood out though was in its characters, especially ones like Joe and Nambu that were very clearly
like an Naya from Africa.
I haven't seen an anime with this many dark-skinned folks since like Michiko and Hachi. With that, the overall tone of his opponents just feel a little bit more than classist, like there's a few more is in there if you catch my drift. But the second season, Nomad, kinda takes those subtle commentaries and turns it up to 11. Now there are even more black characters, Afro-Latinos in particular. But along with increased level of diversity is the new sense of dread found in the world and our protagonists. Joe and other black men in this season have to address their inner demons and darker thoughts when faced with their toughest opponent, themselves. What do you do when the usual coping mechanisms you use in the face of trauma doesn't work anymore? What happens when you can't main character syndrome your way out of sorrow?
So 9 times out of 10, I'm probably going to hell cause I'm the devil. Which means I sold my soul to myself, shelf all my worst fears in a mason jar glasses. Next to all the dreams and things I ever imagined.
We'll start with Joe. He decided to climb up the brackets of Megalonia in Season 1 with no exoskeleton or gear on. Of course, he loves the challenge, but truthfully, he can't even afford to have decent gear to fight with anyway. He learned pretty quickly that they're an in-universe marker of one's class and standing in society. The authenticity of Joe's navigation of a world that wasn't built for people like him and mine isn't just found in his lack of equipment, but also in the contrast between his opponents. He faces off against people that have something to prove, either to themselves, their families, or a corporation. Boxing takes an identity of its own, being the main way characters resolve their conflicts, inner and outward. Joe starts being referred to as Gearless Joe, representing how enthralled audiences are by his tenacity and refusal to stay down, even when in the face of essentially rich-ass cyborgs. Season 2 starts and we are down horrendous. Joe is throwing himself in fixed fights again, taking opioids, and now he's going by a mysterious new alias. He's now even wearing gear. It's clear that we're not looking at the same champion protagonist that defied the odds before. The reality is, Joe's been drowning in sorrow ever since losing his title 5 years after the end of the season prior. On top of Nambu dying and running away from everyone he's ever cared about, he's now nihilistically wandering the slums, convinced there's no meaning in anything anymore. Despite this second season focusing a lot more on character interactions over fighting, boxing remains to be a great lens to analyze where a character's head is at. Boxing is all Joe really knows and is what made a difference on whether or not he would eat on any given day. He had used it before to bring people from all backgrounds together. but now when faced with the first real challenge that can't be solved solely with his fists, he abandons everyone he loves and goes on a downward spiral, bitter and depressed. Now it's an outlet for Joe to excuse running away from the accountability of his actions. After seemingly succeeding past all the odds, there's nothing he can do in the face of a terminal illness. Rather than stay with his found family in Nabu's final moments, he runs to the ring, chasing some form of escape from the powerlessness he thought he would never experience again because of his strength. Mac Rosario is an extension of the idea surrounding how black men respond to a lack of control. Displaced from a foreign country, Mac too found himself boxing in Megalonia to make ends meet. Unfortunately for him, he was never the best fighter. Actually, he was pretty trash. After quitting and taking a short stint as a cop, I know, an accident occurs, resulting in him being paralyzed from the neck down. Miraculously, he's approached by Roscoe, a neuroengineering company responsible for creating the brain system encoding chip. It's essentially what grants Mac another chance to choose his destiny. It being inserted into Mac's head means that not only he can walk again, but better than before. So much so that he became sponsored by Roscoe to head into the tournament brackets once more to fight his way to the top. And he does so almost flawlessly. An amazing invention for sure, but it seems to have its side effects. From increased stress and probably a bunch of hits to the head, Mac without thinking can sometimes tap into a feral state, Mac time, that essentially gives him a Zenkai boost to just mollywop on anybody that's in front of him. Naturally, one can see where this heads down. He begins to lose control of his mental state around his family, getting nearly as aggressive as he does in the ring. His wife finally has the guts to present him with published articles already warning of the deadly side effects that the chip could have on patients. Sakuma, Roscoe's CEO, knows this all fully well, even as going as far to admit that the only reason why the chip was even given to Mac in the first place was a result of a transaction that his wife did for a heart transplant for his sick son. Secretly, he's even working on giving this chip to the military, on some super soldier shit. And of course, when Mac can't directly beat down on whatever's in front of him to solve anything, he runs, if not to just put himself or his family in any more danger. His agency in this whole thing was never really his to claim. Ignoring whatever New World Order conspiracy you got swirling around in your head right now surrounding chips, dehumanization is a very real, violent reality athletes, especially black ones, face to this day in their sports. Hell, ask the average MMA fighter how they feel about Dana White.
I've been so broke my whole life because of this sport, but it's so worth it to me because I love this sport. But to get a $50,000 paycheck, you know, my husband's gonna tell me to put it away. I'm definitely gonna want to buy some nice stuff, but you know, I like to buy a little bit of things for the house and for my animals. I really like to spoil my family, but you know, this week I'm definitely taking my team to go get a nice dinner. So it's life changing for sure, but I just, you know, gotta put the money away and just go out there and fight again.
To be taken advantage of in this way, warped and transformed into an instrument to not only line someone else's pockets, but also indirectly, kinda directly aid in the military industrial complex, like you're somebody's lab rat, it nearly breaks him. And just like Joe, he runs, afraid of hurting anyone else now that his one ticket to prosperity comes at the cost of his life. Nomad and the entirety of Megalobox is a story that confronts the truth that despite how much potential is locked behind our inner strength, we still can't Sigma male grind set our way out of emotional and physical burnout. Pretty much all the characters are at different points in their lives, discovering, rediscovering, or accepting that they don't really have as much control as we might think we do. Ignacio, or Chief as everyone refers to him, represents a response to the absurdity life brings that black men commonly adopt. Just keeping it cool. Chief embodies unabashed and unashamed hope in the face of despair. Constantly smiling even though ain't shit funny. Always keeping it cool because he can't afford to let anybody see him sweat. He's basically this show's version of Muhammad Ali, in a nutshell. Part of what makes someone like Chief so persistent was actually watching Gearless Joe rise up through the ranks before. Seeing an undocumented black man receive glory for boxing that way inspired him to find a deeper purpose in life. One night during another stupor, Joe happens to meet Chief at a bar. Chief decides to go out for open mic and sing this season's ending song, El Canto del Colibri. The next night, they actually have a chance encounter in the ring, where Chief identifies our Nomad as Joe, despite how much he's trying to hide it. For the first time in a long time, Joe gets that rush of a good fight just pumping in his veins. You then can see how much it disappoints him to just see Chief completely throw the fight for money. Joe confronts Chief about his blatant lack of honor for the game and subsequently gets his shit rocked. Yeah, I hate a hypocrite ass nigga too, bro. Chief looks actually disappointed when he can tell that drugs are causing Joe to slow down and lose his former momentum. That song that Chief sang is based on a folk story of his people, where an exhausted traveler is pestered by an eager hummingbird to hear its song. For the remainder of the show, this story remains to be a consistent motif characters pull from. The nomad is told by the hummingbird to find resolve within the sorrow of the day-to-day. He has to take a brief moment to touch grass and smell the roses in the midst of his misery. A monsoon destroyed Chief's home back in his country, so he and a large group of refugees from a settlement in Japan. He and Mac are actually both from the same country. Home for Chief now, though, starts with starting over in this foreign land as a widower and after losing his son on the journey to Japan. We see how this new home is already being faced with opposition pretty much as soon as they show up. Immediately, they're faced with discrimination and told to go back from where they came. Petty landlords force them to pay outright for the land they chose to stay at. It's then on Chief's shoulders to join a local boxing tournament and win the cash prize so that he can buy the land outright. And somehow he's still smiling. Circumstances lead Joe to meeting up with Chief once more, now at the mercy of drug withdrawals. After some soul searching and being haunted by souls, Joe decides to not only become Chief's cornerman for this tournament, but also fully get clean from opioids. Finally, we're able to witness an actual attempt to overcome the grief clouding Joe's psyche. Empathizing with Joe over their mutual understanding of loss, Chief's training is really the first time we see Joe rest and reevaluate what he considers important. They both share an intimacy that allows them to both be vulnerable with each other about what they want out of life. Just bros being bros. We get to the final fight of the tournament and Chief's opponent is just throwing illegal blows, referee not calling nothing, along with just racist vitriol being thrown from the crowd and every cheat in the book against him. Chief snaps and finally loses that cool that he's worked so hard to maintain up to this point. You can tell how long all of this stuff has been eating at him, all this trauma. But rather than judge him, Joe is able to extend that same grace that he had bestowed upon him and guide Chief back down to earth. Eventually, Chief slides out the W for the fight, knocks that man clean out. Deep down, you know those hits have to really hurt, but Chief will be alright, right? Joe and Chief's last conversation was short, but it ended with Chief telling Joe that he's a part of his family now. He died that night, in his sleep, with a smile on his face. Towards the end of that folktale, the nomad hears a hummingbird song one more time after some more constant pestering before it flies off for good. Later on in the day, the nomad is still on his journey when he sees the hummingbird slowly dying on its path. He buries it, and later on he approaches an ocean, asking for one wish to be granted. Instead of fame, wealth, or even death, the nomad after his long journey only asks for a way back home. Joe is gifted Chief's signature gear as a parting gift, emblazoned with a hummingbird. He finds a resolve to reconcile with his family, not expecting complete forgiveness, but at least making an attempt to provide closure. It takes some time, but through actual dialogue concerning how everyone feels, Joe is able to make progress for the first time in years. Chief is essentially the link that brings Joe and Mac's healing journeys full circle. His earnestness about the struggles of life is essentially what brings Joe out of his rut, which in turn leads Mac to be fully committed to claiming his agency. The last arc of the show surrounds their upcoming fight at Megalonia, carrying all this baggage with it. When Mac and Joe finally do reach the ring, it's well understood that neither fight nor flight will fully solve all their issues. Joe's now dropped the gearless title, utilizing the same gear Chief became a champ with. He knows he's not the same boxer from all those years ago, with the painkillers and just normal effects of getting punched in the face multiple times, but now he knows he doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. Being equipped with a gear isn't a self-imposed handicap. It now represents solidarity with a found community, and also healing old wounds. Mac fights hard, still with the chip lodged in his head, but intentionally not allowing himself to lose control and go into Mac time. Refusing to remain a cog in the machine, Mac is able to keep it cool. He also decides that it's his turn to make decisions that are best for Mac. They both decide to not define their futures by the unreasonable expectation that niggas just have to be okay at all times. It's easier to forgive yourself and be relieved of toxic performances of gender that way. Mac is reminded of the same folk story of his people when he sees Joe with Chief's gear on, and they bond over it. The nomad has now become the hummingbird for a new nomad, guiding him to find his way home. It's beautiful just seeing bros be bros, man. Fun fact about the hummingbird, did you know that it's actually one of the only birds to migrate alone? I'm on my Zubamafu shit right now, so let me rock. They can travel up to 6,000 kilometers between Mexico and Alaska and do it all on their own. They're also the only birds that can fly backwards, so like, imagine a helicopter but in bird form. They see colors that we're not able to perceive because their eyes can see UV light rays, which helps them find better sources of food. Really think about that for a sec. There are probably hundreds of thousands of colors that you have not even seen before, that you're just not able to see. I guess growth at many points can feel like you have no choice but to sprout. In recent days, it's definitely become more normalized for black men, black folk as a whole, to open up about their darker thoughts. In the face of institutional and societal setbacks especially, not wielding a sense of control can be agonizing. Our anger and violence aren't justified, but sitting on our hands can lead us to manipulation. Vulnerability is seen more as a weakness instead of an extension of an olive branch. It can be easier to say, let things work out the way they need to, and niggas get shot every day, B. You'll be alright. But in practice, that means accepting that things can go wrong just as much as they can go right. Uncertainty and anxiety about what can come next is a trip. I lastly want to squeeze in some time for Mio, a kid from the refugee settlement. In a brand new country, of course, he gets acquainted with the wrong crowd, finding himself doing horrible things out of a fear of not fitting in and standing out too much. This fear of isolation leads him to shave his head, a visual attempt to cut off all attachment to parts of him that just aren't welcome here. It's natural that he acts out in response to his masculinity being policed this way, including stealing Joe's motorcycle, which leads Joe to meeting Chief for the tournament. For all these characters, their blackness serves as a constant target of violence and othering. Mio literally almost burns down the entire camp at one point, and of course he runs away because he doesn't know how to deal with his emotions. But it's only at that point that he realizes the self-hatred that he's developed will only spiral him out of control, away from those that really love him. By the end of the show, he has a new resolve, inspired by both Joe and Chief to choose self-determination in the face of nothing really making sense. With his hair grown right back out at the end of the show, it's symbolic of the journey that so many black people as a whole can understand on a deeper level. Entering a space not welcome to them, and concurrently working hard to accept the parts of themselves that make them stick out like a sore thumb. No, being a black man doesn't automatically make you the toughest one in the room. The most uncomfortable thing about Megalobox's black men is that they have to address their own humanity, allowing themselves the space to heal. I think the story of the Nomad works extremely well because the hummingbird is able to represent the idea of reinstilling self-determination when you're down and out. Despite how blinding grief can be, sometimes you need someone, or something, who can see things in a much brighter view.